Memorial Day. Here we go officially. Welcome everyone. My name is Mary Del Hayes. I am here on behalf of the Together SC team to have a really exciting learning opportunity. Many of you, I see lots of old and new friends alike, and many of you have been part of the discussions Together SC has been hosting across the state over the past year related to the 2022 South Carolina Nonprofit Compensation and Benefits Study, which was conducted by Bob Kale of Kale Strategic Insights and Gloria Roderick of G&G Analytics. Bob and Gloria put together a really comprehensive, deep dive look into compensation and benefits for nonprofits in South Carolina. And it's a lot of really compelling information, not just to help you understand where salaries fall for specific positions, but also looking at trends related to salaries and benefits at nonprofits across the state. We know that budgets are always tight and it's hard to make the best benefits and salary package possible for your employees, but we also know that that is critically necessary work. One, for us to be able to attract the best and brightest talent to address our critically important missions, but also so that once we get that talent, we can keep it. And so I'm really excited to have the opportunity today for us all to learn from Nick Osborne with the Lowcountry Food Bank. Nick has more than 30 years of professional experience as a leader in development and humanitarian operations in the nonprofit sector. And he has worked with more than 40 developing and high-risk countries with global and international organizations. Nick started his career as a volunteer in Zambia, working alongside rural farmers on food security, and later joined CARE as a sector coordinator addressing the livelihood needs of communities in peri-urban settlements in the Copperbelt cities of Zambia. He then established CARE's presence in Malawi and developed a range of poverty-focused programming that covered a broad range of rural agriculture and safety net programs, as well as emergency response, health, and education programs. In 2005, after the Asian tsunami, Nick headed up CARE's program in Sri Lanka, which included a focus on the Asian tsunami response and recovery programs in an increasingly complex conflict environment. In 2009, Nick served as CARE's regional director, overseeing the operations of regional and country office strategy, programming, and performance across the Asia region. In 2012, Nick moved to CARE's headquarters in Atlanta and served as Vice President of International Programs, directing global humanitarian program delivery across 5 continents with a focus on eradicating poverty and social injustice. And we are so lucky that in 2020, Nick moved to Charleston and took up his current position as President and CEO of the Lowcountry Food Bank. I know a lot of that work is still critically important and very relevant here in South Carolina as we continue to grow and work to bring our communities up to basic standards of living as well, especially when we think about being able to afford a living wage for employees. And so I'll let Nick talk more about how they got into this journey, looking at salary bands and how to have a way to approach pay equity within your organization without a tremendous outlay of cash. And please, again, feel free to use the chat, drop an introduction, tell us who you are, where you are, and what organization you're with. And we'll continue to monitor the chat for any questions or comments as we go throughout the webinar, and we'll open up the floor for questions again at the end. And so with that, I am going to turn it over to Nick. Thank you again, everyone, for being here. We are so grateful for your support and your interest in this topic, and we look forward to continued conversations as we go on.
Great, thanks ever so much, Mary Del. Really appreciate it, and really happy to be here today to share some of our experiences at the Lowcountry Food Bank as we look at addressing issues of salary, benefits, and obviously trying to meet what's required in the context of a market. Just to say before we start, Teresa Johnson's also joining me here as well. So Teresa is our Director of People and Culture, and obviously will add, especially when we've got any questions or any comments as well as we go through. So I'm going to share my screen. Let me just check. Can everyone see my screen? Great. So I'm going to run through sort of a case study, if you like, in terms of what we've done at the Lowcountry Food Bank here in terms of position grading and pay equity. Refer to it here as a DIY, and you'll see a little bit more as we go through why I'm referring to it as a DIY. And please feel free to stop me at any time if you've got any questions. So some of the objectives of what I'm going to go through today is basically I'll highlight some of the challenges and issues that we had here at the Lowcountry Food Bank that were created by inequity, both in terms of staff positions, titles and grades, but also pay as well. So sort of, if you like, the Gordian knot that we had, that we found ourselves in, and therefore had to try and resolve or undo. And as a result of that, share the process that we went through internally. And we did this without consultant support. And I'll go a little bit into some of the reasons for that and some of the advantages of that. To work internally through an internal process, to be able to look at establishing equity across our staff positions, and therefore from that, our pay and salaries. And then I'll give a couple of reflections on the process, having gone through it, and some of the key sort of learnings, if you like. Before we start, I just wanted to talk about some principles, if you like. Again, whenever you go into any of these processes, I think it's important to sort of set some expectations. First of all, review what others are doing. And I think this was something that we did, feeling that we didn't have to recreate the wheel or start from scratch. I mean, there's nothing wrong with taking what others are doing, learn from that, copy it, adapt it, and implement it in your own context. So, for example, what I'm going to go through at the moment, especially with regards to the grading that we did, this was something that we took from another food bank in Manor up in North Carolina, out of Asheville. We're able to take what they had been doing and look at adapting it and applying it to our context. Secondly, I think aiming for good enough. I think we all want to try and be perfect. We want to get it absolutely everything correct and all the I's dotted and all the T's crosses. But I think the process we went into, let's just get good enough. If we can get to good enough, that's better than what we have now, what we had. So good enough was going to be something that we would settle for. Also, as we go through these processes, there's a certain level of, there's this art versus science. Again, it relates to the good enough and perfection. So some of it is about judgment, and there's not always an exact answer to it. Also, I think principle, you don't need to be an expert on this. I mean, I think you can learn by doing, and I think by learning by doing in and of itself has a lot of benefits. And some of that is wrapped up into the benefits of doing it yourself, as opposed to relying on an expert or a consultant to do it for you. Again, there's no perfect answer. And then finally, at the end of the day, not everyone's going to agree with the results. You're never going to be able to go through a process where everyone is going to agree with everything that you've done. So just wanted to put a few of those principles out there because they sort of helped to guide us as we went through this process. So just thinking a little bit about, these are just some of the problems that we were facing before we went through this process. And I'm sure there's many other problems as well that others are facing, and there was others that we faced as well. But obviously we've been through so many challenges and changes and uncertainties over the last few years. I mean, obviously we've all been through this really challenging pandemic, which has created lots of issues for us. It's created lots of opportunities at the same time as well. For some organizations, and we were one of those organizations, we expanded as a result of having to respond to the pandemic over the last couple of years. And that often meant that we expanded quite quickly, and that meant that our staffing levels grew, and sometimes those staff came on board without some clear thought as to where they fitted into the organization. So we found ourselves in a situation where we had a large number of staff, probably around about 75 staff, but we didn't have any form of grading within the staff. We had staff with job titles, but they weren't fitted into any form of structure. And therefore there was no logic in that. So if we've got staff with job titles and there's no structure associated with that, it becomes very difficult to do any sort of comparisons or any sort of make any sorts of decisions around comparing one job with another, purely based on just looking at titles alone. As I said, lack of consistency across job titles And as a result of that, that was creating a perception of inequity across positions. So if you have positions that have titles that are director and titles of manager, instinctively you think that the director position is obviously more senior than a manager position. But then if you looked at it and thought, well, hang on, this director has a director title, but they're not supervising any staff. So what are they directing? Whereas you have managers that are managing a number of staff, and therefore, well, why are they considered a lower position than a director if they're managing staff? So it was all those perceptions of inequity that were created. It also became very difficult or impossible to defend positions and their responsibilities if you didn't have this structure. And then by extension of that, you have all the challenges associated with salaries. How do you assign a salary to a position if it's not set in a certain structure and you don't know where it fits in terms of its responsibilities, especially in comparison to other positions? We also found that as a result of this and not having any structure associated with our job, our positions, it becomes very difficult to be able to make decisions around, especially when it comes to pay. When you're hiring a position, for example, if you're just hiring a position, you don't know where it fits in the organization because you don't have the structure, then decisions on pay become very challenging. And we find that often there was a focus on the title as opposed to what the job did, and or more challenging, of course, the person as well. So this all had negative impacts, or has the negative impact on our recruitment, retention, but also how we talk about future growth as well. Because if you don't know where a position fits in an organization, or it randomly floats in an organization, how can you start to think about retention and opportunities for professional growth if you don't know where that position's going, or where a person can go from the position that they're in at the moment and where they could be promoted to in the future? And then finally, it created a lot of challenges. It creates a lot of challenges for us in terms of doing any form of comparative surveys. One of the reasons why we got into this, found ourselves in the situation and decided to take the course that we did was there was an action, or we identified an action organizationally to do a job equity study, but then realized, how can you do a job equity study, a position equity study, or a salary equity study if we didn't have any structure or any rationale behind how our positions were structured in the organization? Because you were comparing apples with oranges as opposed to apples and apples, if you like. And so therefore, if we were to launch into a salary equity study and we didn't have any structure to assess against, we ran the risk of actually creating more problems for ourselves. Hence, therefore, the reason why we decided to take the first step of looking at creating a salaried position, a job responsibility structure and a banding, and then we could do a look at our salaries. So we took a two-step approach towards establishing equity across our positions in the organization and pay. So the first step we took was we did a job factor analysis. So that was being able to establish this accountable graded structure that was based on position roles and responsibilities and not on titles. And from that enabled us to then have that solid baseline to be able to move to doing a pay equity, looking at pay equity across each of our position roles and responsibilities, and establishing an equitable pay structure for our organization moving forward. So looking at these steps one at a time, just to give an overview as to how we moved forward with these. So first of all, what is a job factor analysis? I mean, as I said, this was a process that I'm sure many of you have potentially used this before as well. But it's taking a framework or an organizing framework that considers a number of different factors that you can apply to each position that you have in the organization, and consistently analyze those across the different job types and their responsibilities. And these are the factors are listed there. So looking at what does, in a particular position, what is the knowledge that position, what are that's required? What are the planning and organizational responsibilities required for that position? what level of complexity and problem solving does that position require? The levels of decision making, the supervisory responsibility, the human or business relations, so that's both internally and also externally. And I think importantly for us as well, also the working conditions, because in an organization like ours, where we have staff that both work in an office context, but also work in a warehouse context, it's giving recognition to the challenges and the issues associated with working in a much more difficult environment in a warehouse than someone, for example, sitting in an office in front of a computer. So these were factors, 7 factors that we were able to assess for each position that we had in the organization. So just to give an example of these, I've got a couple of examples of each of these. So this one here, so this is an example of the first one around knowledge. So it's a process of scoring a position. So you would take a position, we took each of our positions and we scored them in terms of what that position requires in terms of both knowledge, and in this case, this is a matrix that looks at both knowledge and experience. So what level of knowledge or education is required? Does a position require a degree, or does it just require a high school equivalent qualification? And related to that, what amount of experience does that position need as well? Do you need someone that has 2 years of experience, or do we need someone that's had up to 5 years experience? What I like about this is that it's giving greater recognition to the experience. So if you're scoring this, if you're going along horizontally looking at education, the scoring from one level to the next is less than if you were to score vertically going down from an experience perspective. So I think if you take the 2 years of experience running from A, B, C, D along the horizontal line there, that is increasing in increments of 20. Whereas if you're looking at experience, it's increasing in increments of 30 or above. So in essence, this is giving greater recognition to the importance of experience in any position. Here's just a second example, planning and organizing. So again, taking a position and looking at what is the position's responsibilities in relation to planning and organization. So for example, a level 1 would be a position that basically there's little planning that needs to be done by the position. It's already preset, it's routine, and doesn't require anyone to think outside of the box in terms of any planning. It's routine tasks, and therefore that position would score quite significantly lower at a 25. Whereas on the other extreme, where planning is more associated with being much more strategic, it has longer term business implications, it's usually potentially through delegation to others with oversight. It's obviously a much more complex responsibility, and therefore obviously it would score a much higher score. So each of these factors has a scoring associated with them. So going through each position, looking at each position and scoring them with each of these factors. This here is just a summary sheet where each of those factors would be scored against each position, would be totaled up to a total score. This is just an example of where how that would be summarized. On the left-hand side, you've got what would be a current position. On the right-hand side is a new position. So if you're looking at rescoring a position, you could look at the old versus the new. So the process, so that's just outlining the process that with the outline of the structure that we use. So how do we actually do that to assess and score each position in the organization? First of all, before starting this process, we clearly communicated how we were going to go about this, the process that we were going to use, and shared that across the organization so that all of our staff knew that this was what we were doing and this is how we were doing it. We then worked with department heads. So our department heads each analyzed their positions in their team. And it was important here that they analyzed the position and not the person. So looking at the position and assessing them against each of those factors and creating a score for each of those factors, which then gave a total score for each position. We emphasized the idea of not focusing on the person, but the position, by saying that if you were to hire this position today, what is it that you would expect of that position in terms of knowledge, planning, decision-making, supervisory responsibilities, and score it in that context? It was interesting going through this process as well, because we also found that in some cases, job descriptions needed to be updated. So it also highlighted the necessity and the need for job descriptions in some cases that hadn't been updated for a long period of time, needing to be updated. What we also established was a job factor working groups, if you like. So this was a small team of staff from representatives from different parts of the organization. There was 4 that made up this team that were able to operate as a filter, if you like. So after each department head had assessed and scored and done an initial scoring on each of their positions, that was then reviewed independently by this working group, the small working group. So the small working group reviewed the initial scores for each of these positions, and that helped in terms of ensuring that was consistency across each department and across each position as well. In a number of cases, the working group then identified some questions or comments. Those were then sent back to the department heads, who then took those questions and feedback and then looked at adjusting or taking on board those comments, and then submitting a either revised or justifying why they had scored a position in the way they had scored. So this was a process of iteration, and therefore enabled us to land at final scores for each of the positions that we had in the organization. And I think one of the challenges that we've had, just as an aside, I think we had an organization of about 75 staff, and we had somewhere around about 60 different job titles. So therefore, it was a very challenging situation by having such a number of job titles that gave no relevance to the different responsibilities. So from doing this, we were able to, for every single position that we had a score for them. And then we were able to then list those positions from the lowest score to the highest score. And from that, we could then look at identifying particular job grades. Those particular job grades were identified in terms of how the scoring tended to cluster. And again, this is where the more of an art than a science to this. There's no perfect answer to this. The way that we did this, using the working group, each of the members of the working group took it on their own to think about where they would identify the different clusters and the different grades. Doing it individually, we then brought it back to the group, and the group were then able to look at how each of us had assessed and thought about how we might grade it. And they were able to pull that together into a final decision around how we would best cluster different job titles against their scores into different clusters, which enabled us to therefore create what is 10 grades across the organization. Interestingly enough, some job grades, for example, especially let's say you get down to sort of an E and an F grade, included both manager titles and director titles, which again emphasized the importance of focusing on responsibilities rather than titles, because it took into account the relative responsibilities that a director title may have versus a manager title. Having presented this and worked through this, we were then able to take that to a leadership team, discuss it, and then agree on it. And so therefore, by this point, we'd moved from an organization that had a proliferation of job titles with no clear delineation as to where they fitted in a structure, to now having a clearly defined set of grades, job grades, each with job titles associated with each grade. So from that, we were then able to, and having established that baseline, we were then able to take that and then look at doing our pay equity study and looking at pay equity across the organization as a second step. So the objectives for us in terms of establishing a pay equity across grades. First of all, this therefore enabled us to build from the job factor analysis we've done, and having got a graded staffing structure, we could then look at salaries, current salaries, across each of the grades, and be able to identify a lot clearer where there was inequities within each of those grades, and where staff were not being paid to the point where they needed to be paid in respect of their roles and responsibilities. So we had 3 goals for the pay equity piece of work that we're doing here. First of all, as I said, to identify and address any inequalities that existed within and across our different grades. We took that and to a second goal, which was therefore to identify what was therefore going to be our minimum living wage value, and adjust that against those salaries that fell below what we defined as a minimum living wage moving forward. And then from this, that enabled us to establish a salary structure with bands and ranges for each grade. Now, in doing this process, we made it very clear to staff that it was important to note that as we reviewed salaries and looked at pay equity, no staff member was going to find themselves in a situation where they were going to have their salaries cut. It was the complete opposite. We were looking at inequalities where we felt that staff were being underpaid in relation to their roles and responsibilities, and therefore salaries would be adjusted upwards. So therefore, how did we address the inequalities as the first step here within and across grades? So what we were able to do, having now got clearly staff, our positions graded, we were able to plot positions in their grades against their salaries. And the graph on the left here shows very simply what that might look like. So for example, running along the horizontal axis there, you have grades A and B. And as you plot from the lowest score on the left in that grade to the highest score in that grade against their salary, you can see what you would expect is a fairly uniform increase in salary. And similarly, as you move into a grade B, as you plot that out, you would expect that the lowest salary in a grade B would be somewhere in the medium or the middle of a grade A, and would continue to increase. In this example here, as you move to a grade C, and this is where we found the challenge, as you started to plot this out, there were instances where the lowest paid staff in a certain grade was paid significantly lower than the lowest in grades below them as well. So clearly there was an inequity here. So the example here, the dashed line number 1 there, shows where the lowest paid staff member in a grade C was actually being paid significantly less or less than the lowest paid staff member in a grade A and B. So that was an inequity that we therefore needed to correct and move upwards. And so therefore, in this situation, we were able to increase that salary. So the objectives of establishing the pay equity, So moving forward from that, the second objective that we had was moving towards what we wanted to define as a minimum living wage value. Not the minimum wage, but a minimum living wage. So we first of all did some work, some analysis to try and assess, well, what would we define as a minimum living wage? We analyzed a lot of data to look at this and considered a lot of different variables. For example, as an organization, we work across the 10 coastal counties running from Horry County down to Jasper. So one of the pieces of analysis that we did was we tried to look at the minimum living wage for each of the counties where we operated and took the average of that to assess what value that would give us as a minimum living wage. What we finally decided on was we established our minimum living wage to be based on the average across the Tri-County, the three counties and the Tri-County, Charleston, Berkeley, and Dorchester, given the fact that that was where the majority of our staff lived. And when we looked at the data on that, that gave us a minimum living wage value of $19.42 an hour. So our intent was to move towards or look at ways and means in which we could move our staff salaries to at least get as close as possible to a minimum living wage. Now, obviously, a lot of this is, you've then got to think about this in the context of budget, the availability of resources, and we set this minimum living wage as a goal for us over time. And as part of that goal over time, we decided that as an initial step, we would move from what was a current minimum wage of $16 an hour to a minimum entry wage of $18 an hour. Now, this doesn't mean that we've met the minimum living wage, but it's a step towards that, and we would look at strategies and ways and means of moving further towards that $19.42 over time. But it certainly gave us a direction, and it gave us an intent, and it gave us a commitment to the organization in terms of how we were moving our salaries to be consistent with what was considered to be our ability to meet that minimum living wage. So what did that mean? How do we also do that? We then broke that down a bit further as well, because obviously if we took staff that were already on $16 an hour, one of the challenges that we had was you've got a lot of staff compressed at that lower end. And if we were to just take everyone that was on between $16 and $17 an hour and move them up to $18, there is a certain sense of inequity in there, because you will have a considerable amount of compression amongst a large number of staff on that lower salary end. So we looked at a segmented approach where we said that in line with that minimum wage of $18 an hour, we took an approach where we said that anyone in our grade A and B salaries that was on less than $18 an hour, which meant that they were invariably on $16 an hour, would get a 12.5% increase. So that would move them from $16 to $18. We said that anyone in grade B that was greater than $18 an hour and $19 an hour would get a 9% increase. And similarly in salary C, would get between a $19 an hour and $20 an hour, would get a 5% increase. So we're segmenting that out, and we're smoothing that out across our grades and across our salary bands, so that we haven't got this overemphasized compression on one side of our salary range. We also took into account, or wanted to take into account, staff that had been with the organization for a number of years as well, because we realized that if we were going to move salaries from, let's say, $16 to $18 an hour, we had some staff that were on, let's say, $16.50 an hour, and who had been with the organization for 5 or 6 years. So whereas you had other staff members that had just joined the organization who were already straight onto $16. So there was an inequity in terms of moving someone who's been here for 6 months from $16 to $18 in comparison to someone that was on $16.50 and had been with the organization for 6 years, and moving them up to $18. So we wanted to take into account years of service. So in addition to those changes we made to move salaries, we also included a 10 cents per year of service to anyone that had served over 3 years. So for example, if someone's worked for the organization for 6 years, they would also, in addition to getting the percentage increase, would also get an additional 60 cents per hour as well, in recognition for the years that they'd served with the organization. So those changes that mentioned above there had quite a significant impact, because it resulted in changes of nearly 80% of staff in the lowest 3 grades of A to C, which effectively represented about 60% of all of our staff. So from that, we were then able to establish a salary structure with bands and ranges for each grade. This is something that the organization had not had before. Without having graded positions, salaries were somewhat randomly distributed across different positions, and there was no structure associated with it. So again, there was this perception of inequity from the organization and staff in the organization. So we were now able to put together a clearly defined salary structure around grades, and we looked at establishing 3 bands. So as you said, we had 3 bands against each of our salary grades. The grade A at the far left there represents what would be the lowest salary, which would be $18 an hour. And we've got the bands range from 85 to 95%. So you can then, from $18 an hour, you can work right towards the right by applying those percentages to see what those ranges would then work out being. The beauty of this, and one of the advantages that we see in this as well, by having ranges against each of those grades, is it provides a level of flexibility. I mean, for example, when you're recruiting or advertising, we're able to advertise now for a particular range in a particular salary. So if we are hiring, let's say, a grade A staff member, we're able to give a salary range that represents $18 an hour to what the end range of that is. One of the elements of this as well, as you can see in the middle there, we have the midpoint, which is 100%. That 100% midpoint, in some respects, represents what a market rate might be. But it also provides an important feature for us in that when we do our annual performance reviews, we would provide someone with a merit increase that represents a percentage of the midpoint rather than a percentage of their current salary. So if someone, for example, is on $18 an hour, then and they receive, let's say, a 5% increase, that 5% increase wouldn't be applied against their $18 an hour. It would be applied against what the midpoint value of that is. What this does is, in some senses, it benefits those staff that are on the left-hand side of the salary bands from the midpoint. And the intent here is to try and look at the ability to move staff up through the salary bands in a more efficient way, and again, avoid that compression of large numbers of staff remaining on the far left-hand side. And then the other advantage of now having a salary structure like this was it meant that we could share this with our staff, and we could be completely accountable and completely transparent in terms of where someone's grade fits into where the salary bands are and where their salary is in relation to the organization's ranges for salaries, which is not something that we'd had in the past. So very quickly, some of the reflections on the approach that we took. First of all, I think it's really important, and we found the importance of agreeing on approach with the leadership team. First of all, we've got to get the buy-in and support of leadership in the organization in any process like this. And related to that is agreeing on a timeline. We want to have a timeline that we know that we're going to be able to deliver against by a certain period of time. And that relates very much to, if you like, jumping to the fourth bullet there in terms of communication. You're then able to be fully transparent in communicating to the organization and what the organization can expect in terms of the process that's going to be conducted and the approach that's going to be done, and providing regular updates as well, so that staff across the organization know where the process is and know what to expect as each of the stages of this process is unrolled. As I said earlier on as well, we made the decision not to use external consultants, but to do this internally. And I think we found some benefits in doing this. I mean, one of the challenges with using an external consultant is you can hand that over to an external consultant. They can do the work for you, and then you can remain somewhat detached for that. And the expectation is that the external consultant is going to provide you with a perfect result, which unfortunately is not always the case. By doing it internally, whilst it may have taken us a little bit longer, it did enable us to engage with our staff. It enabled us to create buy-in and support, and enabled us to think about how we can use some of these processes in the future, and how we apply some of the structure that we've created in the process that we've used in the future, rather than being told what we have by an external consultant. The value of establishing a small team, we felt there was a lot of value by having a small team that came together, that was able to act as a tool for ensuring consistency. It also helped in terms of removing any potential bias as well that may inadvertently bring itself up, especially this idea of trying to remove yourself from the person and stick to the position. Again, so therefore moving on to focusing on the position, not the person. That was really important. It's really difficult when you go through any of these processes to not think about the person, especially when you're looking at a position where there is already an incumbent in the position, and not think about that person, but really focusing on the position. And we framed that to help in terms of saying, suppose you had to hire for this position again. How would you score this? What would be the responsibilities of the position? That also helped us identify areas where we might need to strengthen or update some of our job descriptions as well. This also process, I think, is helping us in terms of our decision making as we move forward as well. It enables us to have a defensible and consistent approach to putting together job descriptions, being able to evaluate where that job fits into a structure in the organization. It enables us to think very clearly about how we're going to advertise that position, what salary ranges we are going to adopt for that position, based on being able to justify it back to an analysis that's been done, rather than the way that it was done in the past, which tended to have an element of randomness in it. In terms of the application in the future, we think that this framework helps us as we start to think about opportunities for our staff in the future as well, especially when it comes to, for example, future professional growth. One of the challenges that we face in our organization is, and it's probably similar to other organizations as well, is that as you go up in the organization, the number of positions that are available in the organization reduce. So opportunities and options for promotion become challenging, because as you get up the structure in an organization, there are fewer managers, directors, and therefore promotion becomes a bit of a challenge sometimes. But what we realize with this framework is that we can look at adapting this framework to starting to review a person's responsibility. So for example, if you have a manager, that manager, you can think about professional development in terms of how that manager might take on additional decision-making authority. That manager may have a professional growth related to their ability to take on greater supervisory responsibilities with more direct reports. So within a particular position, you can add greater responsibilities. And then by adding greater responsibilities, you can go back and you can rescore that position and therefore look at how that position, potentially based on its responsibilities, moves up in the graded system. So you're not relying purely on a job title, but looking very much at responsibility. So therefore we see this as an opportunity, this framework, to help us with our retention, but also thinking about opportunities for professional growth and how we can build in professional growth opportunities when we come to doing reviews, which then get reflected in revised job descriptions and potentially rescoring a position based on those new responsibilities. Finally, we think that by having this basis of a clearly defined graded structure and a clearly defined salary structure as well, that will help us in the future when we do conduct any future comparative salary surveys, having that consistent benchmark or baseline to work from, which we didn't have before. So I will stop there. And I'm happy for the slides to be shared as well, if that's helpful for anyone as well. But happy to open it up to any questions.
Wow, Nick, that was an amazing amount of information and such impressive work. I've got a couple questions while people are getting ready to pose their own. One of the questions I had was, did any of the adjustments in salary cause employees to either lose Medicaid coverage or any other public benefits? And if so, how did you navigate that?
No, it didn't. So, I mean, our salaries were at a level where originally were at a level where people were not qualifying for some of those, if you like, but no one lost any benefits at all. We were able to retain the benefits that anyone had had before doing this process, and as we went through it and after it as well.
That's awesome. Then my second question is, I know you mentioned not being able to make everyone happy, and we know that that's always the case. Whenever you do something like this, you can't get 100% satisfaction. Can you tell us a little bit about any complaints or issues that you faced and how you addressed them?
Yeah, no, it's a good question, especially when we did the job analysis. So when we went through the factors, there were certain staff that was a little bit surprised at where they fell in a particular grade. And I think inevitably they look at themselves falling in a certain grade, and they look at others around them and they think, well, hang on, surely I'm doing much more than this person or that person. So why am I in the same grade that they are in? So they raised some challenges and some questions around that. But again, by having the analysis that we have, where we're actually looking very carefully at each of those factors, we had a defensible way to be able to go back to that employee and basically say, this is how we scored the position, and this is the reason why we scored the position in the way that we did. So we were able to use the analysis that was done and be able to explain to the employee why their position was scored in a certain way, and therefore how that reflected in a certain grade. And this, of course, was one of the challenges in the past, because we had no accountable mechanism whereby we were able to compare positions based on responsibilities. That was always a challenge, because someone inevitably looks at, well, I'm comparing myself with this person over here, and I think I do more than them, so therefore, surely I should be paid more. But by having the different factors, we were able to sit down with employees and we were able to have the conversation to go through exactly why we had scored them the way that they had been scored. That also offers the opportunity to say to that employee as well, is that, well, if you want to grow, and if you want to look at how your responsibilities can be expanded, these are some of the areas where you can do that. So if you were to take on more responsibilities around decision making, or if you were to take on more responsibilities around greater supervisory responsibilities, this is how that would change your score, and therefore this is how you would be scored and therefore graded in the future. So therefore, let's have a conversation around what that might mean for your professional development in the future as well. So you can take it forward in that way as well.
That's fantastic. Follow up on that. From what you just said, it sounds like employees know, and I'm guessing it's publicly listed on job descriptions, what grade and pay band things fall in. We know that employees more than ever are discussing salaries and comparing salaries with their coworkers in a way that the workforce hasn't seen before. Is that some of the conversation that happened in your workplace, and how did you prepare for that?
So in terms what moving forward now, based on what we have at the moment, yeah. So the salary structure that we have now, that outlines the grades and the different salaries associated with the different bands, that's shared with all staff. I mean, that's out there for everyone and anyone to see. So any staff member can see where their current salary fits into, associated with their grade, what bands they would fall in. As you say, I mean, staff members are completely open to having conversations with each other to see what their relative salaries are. But we are completely open and transparent in terms of what that salary structure looks like, and we've shared that with all employees. That was something that we didn't have before. So again, there was a lot of uncertainty and a lot of perceptions and a lot of discussion and talk around what people may or may not have been paid. So we are completely transparent. So everyone now has a grade, and they know what the bands are, or the salary ranges are within that grade. When we advertise positions as well now, we're able to advertise on a basis of a range for a position. For a particular grade. That was also causing problems in the past as well, because sometimes if we would advertise for a position and we would state what a salary may be, someone might look at that and say, well, look, I'm doing that job, but I'm paid less than that, or just a little bit more. So why are we recruiting someone at a salary that's similar to what I'm earning? And I've been here for 2 or 3 years. So now we're able to be a lot more transparent and accountable in terms of how we share that information and how we are able to recruit for staff as well.
Fantastic. Another question from the chat. Do you have any independent contractors that you work with, and did you go through this grading process to set rates for contractors?
No, we don't have any independent contractors. No, I mean, this is applied to all of our, so we have both hourly staff and we have salaried staff. So we have, so the salary grades that we have 2 separate ones, if you like. We have one that's articulated in an hourly context and a graded structure that's therefore duplicated, but more from a salary perspective. But we don't have any contracted staff outside of salary and hourly paid staff.
Great. And another question, how are you going to, have you set kind of an allocated budget for coming years to keep up with market changes? And when you made this change initially, what total investment was necessary in that first year?
Yeah, it's a good question. And it's a difficult one to do because obviously, every year we do our budget, and our budgets are based on what we're anticipating our revenues for the year ahead. We built a 4% cushion into our salary line for this current year, which was a 4% that was going to help contribute towards the changes that we needed to make this year. As we move forward in years ahead, we will obviously have to think very carefully about what can we afford in relation to our budget to accommodate, especially as we want to continue to ensure that we're moving towards that living wage, because ultimately the minimum living wage is going to change as well. So you've got to stay in pace with that. You've also got to stay in pace with performance increases as well, based on performance reviews as well. So we'll build that into our budget as best that we can moving forward. As I said, this year we incorporated a 4%. We assumed we were looking at a 4% increase in our salary prices, knowing that we needed to do this exercise and we were going to have to fund that from somewhere. I also look at this also from a perspective of saying, how much does this cost you as an organization if you don't think about mechanisms and ways in which we are able to retain staff as well? Because there's also a cost associated with that as well. So in many respects, it's more efficient, or you get a better return on investment if you think about investing in the retention as opposed to what it's going to cost you to continue replacing staff who are leaving your organization to look for opportunities elsewhere.
Such a great point. Retention is so critical. And I think we as nonprofits tend to underestimate the cost of hiring, onboarding, and training new employees and the impact on the organization for other people. Another question, when you were looking at different positions, obviously you have a range of staff from folks who are working in a warehouse to administrators, marketing person probably. When you're looking at such different types of positions, how did you grade those? And did you look at market rates for those positions in your community across the state? How did you figure out some of those starting pay bands?
We worked, again, that's an interesting, that's a good question. We worked very much from the basis of what we were currently paying staff. And that's what's really helpful about this process. It is taking the association with pay associated with a title or a position and looking specifically at comparing it with responsibilities. Now, I think as we move forward, it's something that we will have to do. We will now have to take what we've got now, and now that we've got clarity around our grades, we are now able to go onto a market and look at, are we staying on track with what a market rate for a certain position is? Because obviously the market pays different positions in different ways because of a different, so for example, a position in a development team or a fundraising team may be in the market may be able to command a higher salary than someone in a different part of the organization. So I think as we move forward, that is certainly something that we are going to have to look at, and we'll look at incorporating that into our future market surveys, if you like. The important part of what we were trying to do at this stage was at least have a solid foundation or a solid base in which we can now go to a market and look at what are we comparing to in terms of the market, what the market is paying. I mean, one of the challenges with that as well is that it's not always as easy as that, because you could be, you're also looking at what is the market paying from a for-profit, a not-for-profit, what is the market paying in terms of a larger scale non-profit, a smaller scale non-profit. So again, those are some of the complexities, I think anyway, in terms of doing market surveys, in terms of what are you comparing against. And I think that's a challenge, but something that we're going to have to wrestle with as we move forward.
I think it goes back to what you said at the beginning, that we're not looking for perfection, but it's just important to get started. You can keep on the process every year.
Great. And I think the beauty of we found the beauty of having the bands as well is it gives us the flexibility. If there is a particular position that the market pays higher, we've got the flexibility within the bands to consider how we would pay that position on the further end or the right side of those bands, if you like. It gives us that flexibility to play with, in the same way that it gives flexibility in terms of someone's experience or the years of experience as well.
And then our final question, what criteria did you use to select the independent team who helped with this process? And were they asked to keep the process confidential along the way, or were there any sort of rules placed around their participation?
That's a good question. I mean, I think you could set up a whole list of criteria in terms of who would qualify for being part of that team and still not get it right. So the main criteria was that it was a small team of staff members who were genuinely interested and who were passionate about this, and who wanted to dedicate some time to be part of a process. So there was no, I mean, we had some broad criteria to say that we didn't want 4 people to come from the same department. They needed to represent different elements of the organization. But really, I think it was really looking at people that felt passionate about this project, that wanted to be part of it, that wanted to give up their time, and could see the benefits of doing something like this. Because so it was really quite self-selected, but self-selected in the sense that it was a representation across the organization. And to the question about confidentiality, absolutely. I mean, that was one of the ground rules of that small team. What was discussed within that small team couldn't be shared outside of that small team, at least until it was communicated with the organization. Because again, fundamental to this is you need to build trust within that small team as well. Not only does each individual team member needs to trust the other one, but also the organization needs to trust that team as well. So trust was another element that was really important, and therefore confidentiality was something that was required.
Well, we have hit right at 11 o'clock. We've gone through all the questions in the chat. This has been such an incredible learning experience. Nick, thank you for taking a process that I think can be very overwhelming to think about starting it, and helping us understand a way that you can walk through this without a tremendous financial investment. Obviously, it takes a lot of time and energy, but it sounds like a great way to help navigate these changes that we're all facing in the market, and to have an approachable process that can guide us along the way. Wow, I have learned so much, and I'm so grateful. For everyone who was here, thank you so much. We will be sharing the slides and the recording either today or tomorrow, so be on the lookout. And I'm sure if you picked up the phone and called Nick for a little bit more advice, he would be happy to talk to you for a little bit as well. We're all here as a resource for each other. And we are really grateful for, one, your membership with Together SC, and two, being here and spending this time with us today. So with that, we will stop recording and send everybody off to have a fantastic day. And we hope that you have a great holiday weekend, and we will look forward to seeing you soon. We've got some great events with Together SC coming up very quickly down the pipe, especially as we are wrapping up the fiscal year for many organizations in June. We've got a legislative recap virtually on June 2nd. There are some opportunities to meet up in person, both in the PD and in Columbia. And we have, most importantly, our Power of Connection membership webinar on June 7th from 10 to 11 o'clock. It's a great opportunity to learn about ways to engage with Together SC. And you can also, if you attend, be eligible, I believe, to win some great prizes. So with that, again, thank you for being here. We hope you have a great day. You can see the link to the events in the chat, as well as Nick's email. Don't everybody deluge Nick at once. He's been a great resource for all of us. And Nick, we cannot thank you enough for being willing to share.